Welcome to a conversation with Marcela Aldaz-Matos, Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Partners Healthcare, and Dawn Frazier-Bohnert, Senior Vice President, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'm Ken Freeman, Questrom Professor and Dean at the Boston University Questrom School of Business. Marcela and Dawn, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dawn, perhaps we could begin with you. Maybe tell us briefly your story, and are there defining moments you've had in your career?
Absolutely. Again, thank you for the opportunity. So very simply, I'll start from the beginning. I'm an Air Force brat. And so when I think about my early history, I'm not surprised that I ended up where I am now, although certainly it was not my plan. But my father joined the Air Force. I was born in Wiesbaden, Germany, and spent the first 15 years of my life navigating different cultures, different communities, being the new kid, trying to figure out how I could make friends and learn the unwritten rules that would make me part of the popular group. So, that was really one of the defining moments that really helped me build skill for this work.
And why did you pursue advancing diversity and inclusion? Have you chosen to make this your professional path?
Sure. So most of my professional career has been in human resources. And that was early on when I left or finished my bachelor's degree here at Boston University. I was focusing on working with people with disabilities. And one of the focus areas for me was helping people find joy and meaning and purpose in work, whatever that meant, and recognizing that we all have opportunities and some limitations. I really transitioned that into human resources, but kept the love of helping everybody find purpose and value and feel like they could contribute to something larger than themselves. So it's no surprise that over time, as I think about the different companies that I worked for, I kept looking for a way to build diversity and inclusion into my roles. And eventually actually became really focused specifically in this space, and have continued to do this work now for quite some time.
Marcela, tell us your story. Are there defining moments you've had in your career?
Yeah, no, absolutely. But to begin with, thank you so much for the opportunity. Defining moment, I am originally from Colombia in South America, and moved to Boston to pursue an MBA. And while working on my MBA, I found an opportunity to make a difference, and it was totally related to my background as a Latina. In the School of Management at that time, we did not really have any specific initiatives.
And this was at Simmons College?
That was in Simmons College. So I had the idea of creating a specific program to help support Latinas. And it became, I believe, the first ever type of diversity and inclusion program for the School of Management. Then I graduated and I went to work in healthcare. And while working on healthcare, also saw and identified an opportunity to help support not only patients, but also members from diverse ethnic backgrounds. Even though that was not my specific role, I always found myself doing work or finding initiatives to help support, to help close gaps related to healthcare disparities at that point. Then I moved into another job, and here we go again. Even though my role was not specific to diversity and inclusion, I did it again, and so that's basically those have been my defining moments.
So making a difference and focusing on diversity and inclusion started early for you, and you've been building on that experience and expertise throughout your career.
Yeah, it does, and I'm comfortable saying it's part of who I am. It's an integral part of who I am and the way I work.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Perhaps we could level set for our colleagues. If we were to define diversity, define inclusion, define equity, three very important parts of the vernacular, if you will. Mm-hmm. Dawn, how would you define diversity, inclusion, and equity, and where do we see the difference?
I think it's so helpful to make sure we're all
level set.
Absolutely.
Language is important.
It's one of the first things I do when I'm talking with people, because I realize that not everybody uses the same definition. I've been very clear, especially when I started at Liberty Mutual, that we had to have a definition that we could all rally around. And so for us, diversity is about everyone. And it is about all of the dimensions that make us who we are. And I think it's really important because, and we understand where it comes from, often it's been made so very narrow. And I think it really comes out of probably, some of the EEO work where we were defining it very much around women and people of color. We wanted to make sure that as we were driving the message that diversity was about everyone, that people would see themselves in that, and they would understand, yes, it is about the things that we've looked at traditionally, and so much more. We also talked about the fact that we're multidimensional people, so it is very narrow just to talk about one dimension. We are gender, our race, our age, our so many things, and that's really been helpful. The second step is to talk about inclusion, which we're all driving for. I know that many people would like to focus on inclusion and maybe get rid of the focus of diversity. And so I am one of those very passionate people that says you need both. We need diversity in order to create an inclusive environment. And you can't really have one without the other. Diversity without inclusion can be just chaos, and inclusion without really having and valuing the diversity that you have just won't happen. So they're really important to me, having both balance. So when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about really engaging and collaborating and managing, I think, the richness that diversity brings to the table. I think that's where you have the opportunity for really true innovation.
And equity?
And equity, which has now become more of a newer term, and I've even seen it in some of my colleagues' titles where they've been adding that. And for me, when I think about equity, it's really about fairness and thinking about sort of more fairness and justice. Often, what is fair isn't equal, and this sort of takes us into another sort of concept, another way of thinking about this work. I don't know if you have another way of thinking about it, but that's how we certainly talk about it at Liberty Mutual.
You mentioned, Dawn, that there are colleagues that are saying, let's move to inclusion and maybe forget about diversity or what have you. Why is that happening in the workplace? Why is that happening in certain organizations?
Sure, I'll take a stab and then
Sure.
I think that even though we continue to do this work after all of these many decades, that still for some people it is so very narrow and people feel left out. And so when you hear diversity, for some people it still goes back to that very sort of focus on women and people of color. And then frankly, men and white men especially feel left out of that. And so it becomes charged. And so we've been working so hard to say, no, if it is about all of us, you are part of this, which means we need you to be part of this diversity work. And I think we just have to continue to help people recognize that the diversity is that's not the scary thing that people think it is. For me, anyway, that's my perspective. That's why people have thought maybe we could just leave that over here and just focus on the good stuff, on inclusion.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to add to your comments, and also and perhaps to illustrate a little bit more what it means. I have met someone a while ago. She is a practitioner in the world of diversity and inclusion, and what she says is that diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is to be invited to the dance. So I think that shows, that indicates really well what it really means. I think that the world and inclusion, the work in inclusion is critical and so important because when you do inclusion in an organization, that's where you activate your diversity. And that is critical, because if we don't do that work, that means that diversity that we bring and they work so hard to bring into the organizations are basically going to stay there, and that you're not going to see the ROI and also the benefits. There are really very interesting, there is an interesting research out there. I think it came from the University of UCLA, that talks about inclusion and also exclusion. And also it specifically talks about what happened in your brain and the employee's brain when you're being excluded. And what they described is that the type of pain that you feel when you're being excluded, that pain is felt in the same area in the brain where you feel physical pain. And it also describes what are all of the different consequences that come as a result when you're not being included. So as we explore a little bit more inclusion, we come to realize and to understand that there are a number of benefits, or what I call the why of inclusion, being one of them the well-being of your employees, which has to do with that stress, which has to do, as I mentioned before, exclusion and what's the impact. There is another really important component, which is financial performance. There are specific studies that indicate how companies or teams that activate that inclusion, they outperform other companies that do not activate the inclusion.
So you mentioned activating inclusion in an organization. How, for instance, do you activate inclusion? It's not an on-off switch. It's much more complicated and much longer term activity. What are some of the approaches that you're using to activate inclusion?
Sure. I actually think that's the harder part, and for me is in some ways the most interesting part, because I think it involves a number of approaches. I think at its core, it's really around building skills so people know how to collaborate with each other. So the way in which we've approached it is by introducing unconscious bias and the concept of unconscious bias, and really creating that awareness so that people really can do the work they need to do to understand themselves. That's a starting point, so that they can understand others better and understand the ways in which, especially as leaders, they may be actually getting in their own way of actually making the best decisions for their team. So that's just one of the programs. But we've been building, if you will, a whole set of tools and ways in which our leaders and our employees can be more aware of their own biases, where they might, without even understanding it consciously or unconsciously, be actually not helping themselves, and therefore not helping the company overall.
And the role of senior leadership in advancing the effort?
Yeah, it's definitely critical, because I strongly believe in role modeling the behaviors, because at the end it's all about the leadership, and when you begin to see your senior leaders behaving in a certain way and being what we call inclusive, or displaying the specific behaviors that shows, demonstrate that they're being inclusive, that makes a big difference, because we begin to see how in the organization the next layers, the mid-level managers and the staff begin to behave in that way. But it goes beyond also about the behaviors, about the impact that it has in the organization, and that's when we begin to create cultures of inclusivity in the workplace.
Harder to measure, I would imagine, than in the earlier days of diversity, when there might have been specific numerical goals, if you will. So how do you convince senior leaders, who very often are very metrics oriented, what are the kinds of measures you would use beyond observation, if you will, of behavior change?
We are very fortunate that we have an incredible talent analytics team that works very closely with my organization. And at Liberty Mutual, we like to measure everything. So one of the ways that we've engaged with this team is to looking at everything, some of the traditional ways that you would look at in terms of your hires, your promotions, your terminations. But it's also to looking for patterns and cutting and dicing it in lots of different ways, so that you can look at it from an age perspective, a tenure perspective, by job family, and then starting to see, are there things in the organization that are in the way, systemically, that are really keeping us from meeting our goals. Certainly things that we would not put in place on purpose, but are there things or practices that we need to revisit because they're not, there's an intended outcome that is not what we had hoped. And so that we can go back and then make some changes. So again, in partnership with this team, we've been able to do some really great work, and even do some work, create some algorithms that would help us understand, how do we think about for the future? Are there ways that we can look at an organization and see, are we at risk of losing certain people based on
analytics.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it's really helped us begin to think about how we think about our workforce planning differently.
And also to add to it, I think that it's really important also to have those analytics and put that information in front of the senior leaders and decision makers, and also compare that information with industry benchmarks. So we can begin to identify how we are, like, what's the current state where we're at, where we could potentially be based on where the competition is at, and what are the implications from a financial perspective. So it's helping connect the dots.
So you're connecting to the bottom line.
Exactly.
Financials is a very important business imperative for growth and
Right.
impact.
Absolutely.
Globalization, the multicultural dynamic of our companies, our firms, how does globalization impact conversations about inclusion at work?
As a global organization, this is very much a part of our conversation, and we also know it's really important that we're not just thinking from a U.S. mindset. So a lot of the conversation has to ensure that we have the right people at the table and that we're thinking about programs and policies that, again, are not just coming from, we're headquartered here in Boston, just from a Boston perspective. We, again, think it's really important that people know themselves, so giving individuals tools if they're going to be partnering, collaborating with people outside of the U.S. and vice versa. So using tools that help people understand how people may look at time differently or space differently, or a number of ways and things that get in the way of true partnership. So that's been part of our process, is to build a set of tools that will help us essentially collaborate, regardless of who we're working with, whatever country,
Right.
So that we can be effective. So it's building
cultural
that cultural dexterity.
Cultural dexterity, cultural familiarization.
Absolutely.
Right.
Very interesting. And if you look within your respective organizations at the proportion of your workforce that is from other cultures than the United States originally, I imagine it's growing dramatically as it is growing in the country. So it's a very important imperative to advance. What's the biggest obstacle you see to advancing more rapidly, creating cultures of inclusion in the workplace?
I think that from my perspective, it's lack of awareness, and also an understanding. And what I mean by that is perhaps going back to what Dawn said before, the conscious inclusion of the unconscious bias part. Because many times what happens in organizations is that there are blind spots that we are not aware of, and they get on the way of building inclusive organizations. So to that aspect, I think that it's really critical as a diversity and inclusion practitioner to be able to identify and understand what is getting on the way. As I mentioned before, one of them being unconscious bias, but it's not just only one. It's really important to take a systemic approach. And in terms of if we're going to be working in education, we also, for us, it's important to take another approaches. For instance, how are we doing communication and marketing and so on to make sure that the messaging it's coming from different directions.
In an organization like Partners, where it's all about medicine, and very often you've got surgeons and others who are saving lives every day, how do you convince individuals such as this to pay attention to inclusion as a big part of what they do?
It is a challenge, and I think that not just only in my industry, but in many other industries. But I don't think it's as much convincing, but it's about building a container within the organization including all these different elements that help support that learning. And this when we talk about learning, we talk initially first about creating awareness, then building or changing mindsets to have an impact on behaviors.
Are there best practices that you have put in place in your organizations that we can learn from, that other institutions can learn from in accelerating the path toward having a more inclusive culture?
We are really pleased, as I said before, we talk about diversity. We talk about diversity being really about everyone. And in the past, I think historically, not at Liberty, but I think just generally, we left people out of the conversation. And so we have really spent a lot of time focusing on ensuring that our men are part of this. And so we have a number of programs and strategies around including men, really letting them know that they have to be part of this solution. We don't want them to be part of the problem. We want them to be part of helping make this happen. And so we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years doing focus groups and really, with their help, shaping some programming. In December, we hosted our very first Men as Allies Summit. So we had over 400 men and women come together, spend a day, and really dig into the work that's ahead for us. And what we found is that that is really amplifying all the other work that we need to do. Because first of all, we have many more people helping us do this work, which is important to everyone. And so we really feel like that is really helping us accelerate the work we need to continue to do.
So being inclusive about advancing inclusion.
Who knew?
Who knew?
We really feel like we should take a page out of our own book, and that's really what's helping us do that.
Yeah, I think that similarly speaking, last year at Partners, for the very first time, we created a Diversity and Inclusion Summit that was led by Partners Healthcare Chief Diversity Officer, Danny Monroe, who has done a phenomenal job in paving the way for building an inclusive organization. So through her leadership, we brought together hundreds of diversity and inclusion practitioners or champions of diversity and inclusion to headquarters offices in Somerville. And it was a phenomenal conversation around inclusion, diversity, and what are the different approaches that we can take systemically and collectively as an organization to help move forward Partners Healthcare in the world of diversity and inclusion.
Lots happening outside the four walls of our companies and institutions, the Black Lives Matter movement, Me Too movement, and more. Impact on your work? Impact on implications for employee involvement?
Yeah, honestly, it is in some ways, although a challenge, a huge opportunity. I don't have to look very far to find new examples or to get people's attention, because I know people are driving to work every day, they're coming into the hallways of our organization, and they're thinking about these things, sometimes pained by what they hear or see. And so our focus has been really, how do we channel then that energy? How do we give people tools to be able to talk constructively about what they're hearing and seeing? How do managers be able to manage their teams when they know some of their team members may be sitting there unable to, to really engage because they're still thinking about what they heard or felt? So in some ways, while it has been difficult, incredibly difficult, we are using this as an opportunity to continue our learning and growing as an organization. At the end of the day, what we say is, we're not, fortunately, we're not the government, we're not running for any kind of office, but we are creating and expecting certain kinds of behavior and the ways in which we have to interact with each other in terms of respect. And so that really is the way that we sort of approach this work.
And I think you said a key word, which is respect. Which is one of the guiding principles in the world of inclusion. We have that similar challenge at Partners, because there is a lot of anxiety. People are coming to work stressed, thinking about it. But we, from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion perspective, have decided to take an approach in which we're inviting people to come to the table and have a conversation. We are utilizing that as an opportunity to build what we call diversity dialogues. And through the diversity dialogues, we bring people from different parts in the organization to have a dialogue. Number one, to develop that skill around talking about your feelings and also listening. And I think that most importantly, what I feel has been a tremendous success is the fact that people are beginning to understand that you not always need to agree, but that it's important that you listened and that you know that not everyone is the same as you are. And that's an art, and it's just so beautiful to see what's happening in the organization when they feel that they have that safe space to have a conversation and come together even though we don't have the same beliefs.
And these movements are all enablers, essentially, to help further enable that conversation. Do you see any individuals in the companies that you are responsible for resisting these changes, or is it primarily supportive, ready to have the conversation and moving forward?
I mean, I would say that, you know, people are in different places on a continuum. Not everybody is in the same place. People might not be telling me directly that they're, and that's okay too. We are trying to meet people where they are and recognize that, you know, people are going to come along in their own time. And then again, I think we're also though holding an expectation for our leaders that they are responsible for creating the kinds of teams that can work together. So there are some non-negotiables, but there's also recognition that people are going to come along in their own time.
And you're beyond the tipping point.
Absolutely.
You know, I think so many companies are now beyond the tipping point, which is so encouraging. The impact of technology, Dawn, you mentioned data analytics has come to human resources, has come to diversity and inclusion. We have AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, so many pending changes being driven by the digital revolution. What do you see as the implications for inclusion in the future in this kind of an environment?
One of the things that is sort of a blessing and a curse is that for many people, these new skills that are kind of on our doorstep are forcing, you know, folks to become reskilled, or there is a concern about loss of a job, of a career. And in many cases, it tends to be sometimes our older generation. So that is bringing up lots of conversation about what does that mean? How do we continue to value, you know, individuals who have, you know, many years, much tenure with us, and not lose all of that that knowledge? And you know, how do we balance? What does that mean when we think about, you know, about the work that we do, the industry that we're in, recognizing that we have to compete in order to continue to be successful. So it's a disruptor. It definitely is. That's something we're working through and looking at how do we, you know, quickly recreate skills for people so that they can keep up.
Yes.
Yeah, and also maintaining balance in the workplace, because now you have a significant number of employees that use technology to communicate. So they're not necessarily in the office, but we still have to make sure that they're communicating, and that when having those dialogues, that we're being inclusive. Managing remote workers, that requires a different set of skill. Yeah, so
it's very interesting that advancing inclusion at the same time we can't anymore guarantee lifelong employment. So that delicate balance, One final question for each of you. If you could offer one piece of advice to the next generation that are completing their educations at Boston University and other universities around the world, what would one piece of advice be from each of you to the next generation?
I believe it's so important to really try to experience as many different things as you can, many different people, opportunities, communities. I think that is something that no one can take away from you, and you take that with you no matter where you go. I think about the opportunity, not knowing at the time it was going to assist me so much, but being able to travel, to be able to get to know people who were not like me, who didn't have the same experience growing up, has really helped me think about the richness that difference can bring to the table. So I think that would be one thing I would share.
Okay.
And my advice perhaps it's around being comfortable, being uncomfortable, being uncomfortable. So what that means is try to push yourself outside your comfort zone. That helped me a lot when I was going through school. Because I was able just to break the mold, and now that sometimes when I'm in difficult situations at work, I feel comfortable because I developed that muscle. What I mean by that is go and visit different communities, learn a different language, that, to me, that adds just so much value to who you are as a person.
So gaining a breadth of experiences all over the world and being comfortable being uncomfortable, taking the risk as you move forward. Okay, well, we've been in conversation about advancing inclusion in the workplace with Marcela Aldaz-Matos and with Dawn Frazier-Bohnert. Thank you so much, Dawn, and also thank you, Marcela, for engaging in this wonderful conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.